Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the last of a series of webinars put together by the Youth Anxiety Center, a collaboration between New York-Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell, and Columbia University Medical Center. My name is Carolina Serrate. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I work at New York-Presbyterian, Columbia University Medical Center.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Dr. Stephanie Rohrig. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in clinical psychology at the New York-Presbyterian Hospital and Weill Cornell outpatient clinic for the Youth Anxiety Center. Thanks for being here.
So we'll give a few more moments for some more people to join in, and we will get started. Want to remind folks to please, if you want to submit questions during the webinar, to do it through the Q&A section and not the chat section. Maybe a few more moments, we'll get started. Okay.
Okay. So thanks everyone for being here. We have a really great topic to review with everyone tonight. So our agenda for this webinar, we're welcoming parents and teens. This is actually the final webinar of this series where we're having both parents, teens, and young adults come together for this presentation. So some of the topics we'll be reviewing include accepting reality. That's a really powerful and meaningful strategy during this time of uncertainty and change. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how to practice this in our lives. We'll also talk about how to find the silver lining throughout this difficult time, recognizing that there's a lot of uncertainty and things that we can't change. How can we make some meaning and finally capitalize on this time that we have? And again, we certainly welcome questions. We do have some of your questions that you submitted at registration that we'll address later on in the presentation, but feel free to add some more in the Q&A section. So this is a really interesting time that we're all in. In fact, we are all at home right now doing this presentation, including myself, and this has been certainly a real change from our normal routines. And so with that brings a lot of distress and uncertainty. Certainly some emotions come up during this change, which we'll talk about in a moment, because these are unprecedented times. We're spending time away from our friends and our loved ones. Certainly that's not by choice, and that could be really uncomfortable and challenging for a lot of us. It can also be really challenging to connect in this virtual world. This is certainly not something that we're used to and prepared for, in connecting by video all of the time or by phone. And so this can lead to feelings of isolation, of feeling disconnected, feeling alone, and certainly for people who are living alone as well. A lot of people have experienced changes in the job market and their careers. Perhaps we have some young adults joining us who are just graduated college or looking ahead in their careers, really facing a lot of uncertainty and not knowing what their future is going to look like. Perhaps there are some parents or adults here who have had jobs and are currently furloughed or lost their job, or their job just disappeared. And that is, certainly brings a lot of distress and anxiety. It's very natural. There's also been a lot of events canceled. We've seen videos of makeshift, celebrations, graduations that have to happen in a new way, which brings a lot of sadness to families, to people who were so excited to celebrate with their families and loved ones these big events. And a lot of us are facing those changes and those losses together. I'm hearing a lot in the news, and I'm sure you are too, about this new phase of potentially reopening. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what that's going to look like. There's no clear guidelines and answers, and it depends on where you are, what your comfort level is, and what people who are, not us making those decisions, what they decide is appropriate. And so that is certainly a challenge, and not really knowing what that new future is going to look like. There's also plenty of loss that we're experiencing. I touched on the loss of loved ones and grief, loss of a job, but certainly we don't want to overlook the potential loss of family members and of friends, of neighbors that have occurred. This is a very difficult time, and the inability to grieve together in the way that we're used to, and all being physically together, is certainly a challenge and something that brings up a lot of emotions. There's a lot of challenges in the economy right now, certainly a lot of uncertainty there, along with job loss and jobs shrinking. And certainly I'm sure that, a lot of us are worried and looking ahead about what that future is going to hold. Dr. Zarate, I know that you've done a lot of work in the next few points in your profession too, and helping people connect to healthcare and how different that's looked. Some people may not have access in the same way, which presents a lot of stressors, a lot of difficulties.
So I think one of the things that we have been hearing a lot is that we are all in this together, which is true. We're all going through this tremendous stressor, but the reality for every family in New York City and across the US and across the world is very different depending on where they were before the pandemic started. So while the skills that we're sharing here are can be used universally, right? We do understand that every family situation is unique and different. In our families or our new pandemic families, right? There's been some communities where people were caught up and had to quarantine with maybe friends or family members that they maybe don't live with. Everyone might have to acquire a new role. And that's also challenging, and also not knowing, depending on your city or your state, how long this is gonna take, right? Particularly for working parents, having to support education for their children, right? Not being able to completely fully attend to their job because they also need to be home teachers, if you may. Having that uncertainty and not knowing how September is gonna look, or just the summer with summer camps. The other thing is just knowing how much time we are going to be spending at home together as a family, right? For young adults who have returned from college, this is a complete change of their game. For young adults that were planning to go to college, this is a complete new scenario. And it may be that because of the economic recession and many different factors, their lives are now changed for the rest of the year, if not longer. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of changes that we were not anticipated and that we do need to cope with and kind of affront.
And so along with this uncertainty and all of these changes comes a lot of emotions. And our first message is that all of this is okay. All these feelings that we're having as a result of this challenging time make total sense. And emotions are actually quite important part of our lives. They send really important messages to us. Feelings of fear or feeling scared or anxious actually alerts us to a potential threat. Feeling anxious when going outside could lead us to take some more precautions, more than we're probably used to. So we're keeping social distance, we're using face masks, we're using hand sanitizer a lot more often than what we're used to. And so that feeling of anxiety or that fear or concern is actually helping us stay safe in a lot of important ways. So it's not necessarily the goal to get rid of all of these feelings, although they're very uncomfortable. And I'm sure we all at points are like, I don't want to feel this feeling anymore. But what rather we're looking towards is how to manage these feelings, manage them in an effective and a healthy way so that they're not controlling us. We feel like we have a little bit more control and not getting in the way of our daily lives. So what's interesting is when we actually fight against these feelings that we have, sometimes that can create a lot more stress and distress. We're going to talk about this a bit in our skill of accepting reality. Is actually the acceptance of emotions that we have is one of the pivotal pieces, because we recognize that non-acceptance can lead to a lot more pain and suffering. And accepting them, interestingly, allows us to cope more effectively. It allows us to actually address the problem, facing it full on. It allows us to kind of choose how we want to respond to a situation rather than reacting in emotion. And I feel like that's such an important difference, even for myself, and noticing when I'm reacting and when I'm responding effectively and thoughtfully and mindfully to a situation.
I'm also just noting one of the questions that was just posted related to emotions. And one of the biggest challenges right now and in life in general is that we need to learn how to cope with our emotions as parents, then help our children cope with their emotions. And as teens and young adults, understand that, you know, as a family, everyone is part of that network of support. So there are spaces that we need to allow each other to cope with those emotions. And there are spaces that we need to allow us to have as a family to share that distress that we could be experiencing together. So then thinking about how do we do all this, right? How do we manage a pandemic, manage a home, manage the loss of opportunities, for some families, unfortunately, manage the loss of a loved one. There's not a good or bad way to do it necessarily. There are different ways to cope, and it's important to find something that makes sense for you individually. One of the things that we actually see that helps in process of distress and grief in different cultures, and if people have spiritual beliefs, there's different kind of ways of interpreting this, is finding a path to accepting what is happening. And that's why a lot of the content today is going to be dedicated to figuring out how do we practice that acceptance and how do we radically accept things that are very difficult, that we can't change. So what does radical acceptance mean? The term per se actually roots from Eastern philosophy or religions, from Buddhism. Today, we're going to use skills that have been adapted by Dr. Marsha Linehan for a specific type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy. But radical acceptance really just speaks to be able to, with whole heart, mind, and soul, kind of completely surrender to our reality and a situation that we can't change, to things that are so painful or emotions that are so painful, but that is impossible to avoid them in our lives. Radical acceptance is about stop fighting reality. And you might be wondering, well, what do you mean fighting reality? Fighting reality can present in many different ways, from being stuck in emotions, from literally being in denial, which for some people and in certain processes is part of grieving and loss. Radical acceptance is about stop behaviors that are determined by those emotions because you're so upset that reality is not the way that you want. It's really hard, but it also means letting go of bitterness. is not about ignoring emotions or suppressing emotions. Is about being in the emotion, accepting the emotion, accepting the situation, and then acknowledging that you don't have control or the power to change it. Is shifting from a mindset of why me to, well, this is what is happening to me. So why do we want to do this? Well, we know for a fact that rejecting reality is just not going to change what's happening, right? It doesn't matter how much we don't want to believe that we lost that job. It doesn't matter how much we don't want to believe that, prom is out the window and I didn't get to get my graduation party. It's just not going to help to just insist that this is not or shouldn't be happening. That's not going to help us change the situation. In order to maybe try to find a different path or an alternative to the situation that we don't like, we first need to accept it, right? So if we are not able to recognize that what is happening, then how are we going to be able to find a different place to go to? As I was speaking in terms of where this whole concept of radical acceptance comes from, and Buddhism and different other religious and spiritual beliefs, in general, the concept that is had is that in life, pain is inevitable. And I think regardless of how old you are, right now you realize this. Life has a lot of painful moments, but you don't need to be stuck in suffering. When you're able to accept this pain, when you're able to accept the moment, then you're able to move on instead of being paralyzed in intense, painful emotions that then perpetuate suffering in your life.
And so it's really the understanding is so clear of how this could be beneficial for all of us in this situation. What's a real challenge for everyone is how do we put this into practice? And I'd say this is one of the most powerful strategies that we have in psychotherapy. It's also one of the hardest to put in to our everyday lives. And so we're going to walk you through some tips and tricks to incorporate this, but please keep in mind, this is a repeated practice. This is something that we do daily, sometimes hourly or moment to moment, and just accepting what is. So it's okay if we find ourselves struggling with this. That's very natural, and it does take some time. So first we'll talk about what is acceptance and what does that mean, following up what Dr. Sarate shared. So it's acknowledging the situation for what it is, including the things that we dislike about the situation. For example, COVID-19 comes with a lot of stress and uncertainty, including a lot of the things that we shared and beyond in the first few slides. And so certainly we don't agree with and don't like any of those things that have been really hard about this situation. The problem is that pushing up against those things and against the situation and not accepting it for what it is often creates so much more stress for us. We're already struggling by piling on the non-acceptance and the why me and why this and why is this happening. That's creating more suffering, like we just spoke about. And so it's acknowledging the situation for what it is, although we may not be agreeing with it or liking it. We want to notice our thoughts and our feelings when we're in acceptance or non-acceptance, actually. Often we can find ourselves thinking, why me? Why this? Why is this happening? A lot of whys, a lot of questions. And these can be really helpful cues for us to recognize that, like, perhaps I'm in a place of non-acceptance. Is this helping me right now? So we can use those as our guides to practice our acceptance skills. And the goal, again, would be not to push them away, but actually to, in an interesting way, kind of harness them and just recognize that they're there and actually see how we can be more effective despite those thoughts in those feelings. I like using the example of having a flat tire. I'm sure a lot of us have been there, myself included, and that is a very frustrating situation. And, you know, one option is to be, why me? Why now? I'm running late to this work meeting, and to fight against that. But fighting against the flat tire and really being stuck in a place of not accepting it doesn't actually change anything. It's not helping us to fix the tire, to put on the spare, or call someone who can help us. And so thinking of that example, acceptance, okay, this is what it is, actually opens us up to some problem solving, to coping more adaptively with the situation, although we didn't like it, and maybe we didn't even cause it, but we still have to deal with it. We're also going to talk through some strategies for acceptance. And I really like this image on the right. It's specific to COVID-19 and recognizing what we can control and differentiating that from what we cannot control. And this goes along with the very old adage of, you know, we can control ourselves. We can't change other people. We can only change ourselves. And it recognizes a lot of that we cannot necessarily control the actions of the people around us. Or predicting the future and what will happen. What is within our control is how we respond, our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And that is a more effective way or area to kind of put our energy into. And so when you're finding yourself in this place of non-acceptance and frustration, perhaps even creating a little list. Okay, what is in my control and then what is not? And focusing our attention on the things that are, we can actually start creating some change and problem solving in a more effective way. I like mantras, especially if we're stuck in these ruminating thoughts and the what ifs and the if onlys. Those thoughts often just get us more stuck. And so the idea of kind of reframing this, like Dr. Zarate had shared, you know, this is happening to me. It is what it is. I can get through this. Some mantra to help remind us and reframe from those thoughts can be helpful, kind of leading us on a different path, perhaps a less emotional path. And then I love the idea of, you know, emotions are like a wave. They come in and they can be quite intense grief, intense sadness, intense anxiety and uncertainty. But they always peak and then they always go away. And so this idea of a wave can be quite helpful if we're finding ourselves in the midst of really intense emotions, just keeping the idea of riding it out until it does fade a little bit, sometimes can help us get through some really painful times.
So one thing that is important to remember is that acceptance is not easy. And as it is not easy, it's a choice that you're going to have to make every day and every moment, perhaps. So whether it's because of a flat tire, or you got stuck in the subway, or right now your subway line is not working, or just simply you're stuck at home and we don't know what's going to happen during the summer. And we're stuck at home with our family who we love, but we don't always get along, you know, and maybe that may be actually something to work on accepting as parents and young adults, right? Relationships are not always easy. Being in a situation like we are often kind of exacerbates sometimes challenges in relationships. Something that is then key to be able to work on radical acceptance and on riding the wave on your emotions is being able to observe where you're at and observe that you're not accepting. How can we tell that we're not accepting a situation? Well, we're stuck in being angry, we're stuck in being bitter, we're annoyed, we're irritable all the time. You may also then not be stuck in the emotion and may feel so overwhelming that you just decide to avoid. So then you go and perhaps just start playing video games or binge watch Netflix for hours on end. Or perhaps you still have a job and then you are working more hours than you were working before. You can also then need to pay attention to your thoughts. Again, thoughts of why me? Why is this happening? I can't stand this. It shouldn't be this way. Now, it's important to note that we're not saying these are not things that should be coming up and they're not okay. It's okay to feel this way. It's okay to have these thoughts. And then it's important to be mindful and observing when you're stuck, because then you're going to be stuck in a place of suffering. So what do you do next? You finally kind of figure out, okay, I'm really having a hard time accepting that I'm going to have to spend the rest of the summer maybe helping take care of my grandmother or taking care of my younger sibling because there's no summer camp, right? I'm in that place. Now, what do I do? You know, I'm angry. I'm thinking about this is not fair. My life sucks. This should have been my great summer before going to college maybe, or before starting a job. I am bitter. Once you realize that, which is not an easy task, then it's thinking about, hey, I heard about this acceptance thing and I need to then make a commitment to accept reality as it is. Now, just making that commitment is not going to change reality, but it does set you on that path of radical acceptance. And practicing every day with little things. You know, you broke a glass and it might have been your favorite glass or mug, or it had a special meaning. And it's okay to feel sad and upset and you wish you could still have it, but you're gonna have to accept that it's broken, and you pick up the pieces and you throw them out. Then what do you do after you've done that? You practice over and over and over again. If you can right now, maybe think about one very difficult thing that you're having issues with accepting in your life, and a simple thing that you're also feeling like you might be stuck in being angry or in rejecting reality. Write it down if you want to, and then maybe these are two things to start practicing, making that inner commitment and reminding yourself over and over again that if you accept reality, that will reduce your suffering, and it may actually open a space to find alternatives, solutions to that next moment, right? We can't change the past. We can't necessarily change this moment right now, but if we don't accept this moment right now, then we will definitely won't be able to do anything different about the next moment.
And I love your point, Dr. Zarate, too, about practicing it even in small things. I think that could be a nice, start when we're practicing with daily things that come up that make us feel frustrated and we don't want to accept. Sometimes when we jump right into the big things in life that we're having a hard time accepting, it can feel quite challenging. And so that might be an option when you're trying out this skill and practicing it again over and over, to start with something small once a day.
And then where do you move from realizing that you're rejecting reality or that you're not accepting reality, you're observing that, you make your commitment and you start committing over and over and over again. Then you start to maybe plan ahead, right? And find things that are helpful for you so that you're able to catch yourself rejecting reality. Everyone is different, and everyone is different, particularly depending on where they are in their stage in life, right? So we all know children, teenagers, adolescents, and adults have different ways of coping with things, right? And being mindful and understanding that everyone will experience different emotions, and for everyone, observing or realizing that they're stuck is going to be an individual process. As a parent, you may be obviously motivated to try to help your young adult or your teen child to practice this skill, right? It's important to allow them to develop that process on their own and radically accept yourself that as much as you would want to help them do it, we really don't have control over that, right? So developing a plan has to include being mindful of your emotions, allowing your emotions to come, right? And then purposely moving and transitioning from thoughts of being stuck to like, this is reality, as we've mentioned already. This is a very last challenging step, but can be very effective and actually very liberating. Even if you're not 100% on letting go of bitterness, you're still upset, you're still angry, act as if you had accepted the situation. What would I do if I had radically accepted that my teenage daughter or son is in a bad mood and I want him or her to feel different and they're not taking my advice, well, radically accept they're just not going to take your advice and stop consistently offering it. And I would assure you there's going to be a shift in that dynamic.
And this is a really hard one too, like acting as if sometimes we have to act and behave in ways despite feeling another way. But often that could be the most effective thing to do. For example, if we're feeling very anxious about leaving the home, understandably because of the COVID-19 concerns, that may not necessarily be the most effective or adaptive thing over a very long time. There's certainly precautions that we may want to take, but we may have to actually take steps to act in ways that are opposite to that anxiety, that fear, as long as we're staying safe and healthy, because overall, we're kind of gaining a little bit more control over our emotions rather than allowing our emotions to control us. And so this acting despite our uncomfortable thoughts and feelings is really pivotal, really challenging, but also very powerful. And we do go through this in some of our previous webinars. If you've seen them, wonderful. If you haven't, please check them out. They're all recorded, where we talk about acting despite emotions.
So as we've mentioned, this is not an easy task. There's going to be many things that are going to get in your way. And one of them is actually not having the skills to do it, right? Skills to have awareness, to be able to observe, to create that space for ourselves, to create that space for our family. The good news, as we just mentioned, there's different ways to make yourself acquainted with those skills throughout our webinars, but also many wonderful resources. A lot of what we discussed today is encompassed in this term of mindfulness. Some of you might be familiar with it. Some of you may just be hearing about it for the first time. Mindfulness is really just the act of being present in the moment, observing our emotions, observing our thoughts, and observing our physical sensations with full awareness, right? In our ability of doing this, then we're setting ourselves to be in a space where we can use helpful skills. If we're just letting our mind get stuck in a lot of anxiety, in a lot of anger, in a lot of sadness, is going to cloud our ability to make different decisions and use skills. So if you feel like, you know what, I'm actually feeling like I don't have, that capacity of like, I'm going to observe my emotion and I'm going to be able to realize this is a moment where it's stuck in anger, then go ahead and look for other supports to improve those skills. All of this is practice, like everything in life, nothing happens overnight. There's no magic bullet, but we know for a fact that all of these things are things that work. When you practice, make them part of your life. And part of your routines if you can. Beliefs can get in the way of radical acceptance. So we've been telling you, you need to just accept things as they are, just, move on with the program, like just radically embrace the moment, and that will feel freely. For some people, that may feel like if I accept the fact that I lost my job, it may feel like I'm just giving up on fighting to get my job back. Or if I accept the fact that my teenager is rolling his eyes at me all the time, then that means I'm never going to be able to have a different connection with them. That is not what radical acceptance is about, right? Radical acceptance accepts the moment to then enable you to find a different approach or solution for that. It also doesn't say that you approve of what's happening and that you're okay. You're okay that you just got hired for a job in February and then you were not even able to get started and you got let go even without getting started. Definitely not okay. But if we don't accept that that's what happened and we're stuck in like fighting the company or complaining to people, then we're not going to be starting to look for another job and then moving on with our lives. So it's not necessarily approving with the unfairness of things in life, right? But it's accepting that they are unfair and they're a reality. And very important, radical acceptance doesn't mean accepting that you will be in pain always. On the contrary, it opens that space to work out of that pain into building a different next moment or a different reality for you. If we have very intense emotions, whatever that emotion can be, it can definitely get in the way of going through this whole process of observing, making a commitment, making a plan. And you know what? That's okay. Sometimes all we can accept is that we are stuck in this intense emotion. As long as we're able to at least get to that place, then we will be able to move forward.
And sometimes we may need to piggyback some other skills with radical acceptance and use multiple skills at the same time. In some of the other webinars, we do touch on different coping strategies, ways to kind of bring down our distress to a more manageable level so that we feel like we can take more effective steps forward. So, these skills are not used separately. In fact, we're really skillful when we're combining the skills that really work for us. So for example, some distraction for you when you're feeling quite angry, perhaps you need to take some space. When you're feeling anxious, you need to write things down. Using these other strategies can get you one step closer to using this acceptance and coming to that place. So it's okay and actually encouraged to be able to use some extra skills and use what works for you. So this idea of finding the silver lining in the midst of all of this stuff going on is actually a pretty interesting one. And accepting can allow us to get to that place. You can see the potential positives of this time. Now, that doesn't mean it washes away all of the negatives. But if we turn our attention to some of the positives, sometimes that can change our emotional experience through this time. And so, interestingly, this time is very unique, right? A lot of us find ourselves having a lot more free time available and unstructured time. While that can create some challenges, especially when you have kids at home, it's also free time for more activities, perhaps things that we always wanted to get to, but we never had the time. This is a nice opportunity to learn and explore some new skills, perhaps things that you always felt intrigued by, but didn't have the time. It's also a nice opportunity for building mastery, perhaps something that you were doing that you want to focus more time on, like, for example, playing an instrument, reading a book that you've been slowly going page by page on. Perhaps you're really into cooking and you like to explore or bake some new recipes. So we can use this time to kind of explore new activities, things that we like, or get really good at the things that we already like. This is a really interesting time too, and allows us to kind of focus on our relationships. Particularly the relationships of people that we're living with, if you are living with someone right now, with family. For a lot of our young adults, they perhaps were away at college and came back abruptly, and they're living back at home with parents or caregivers. And that could be a real shift in the dynamic, but interestingly, a time to kind of explore and strengthen those relationships. Perhaps we're able to connect with people in our family, but outside of the home, reaching out more often in a helpful way to older family members or family friends who perhaps are a little more isolated. And building that rapport in those relationships could be really interesting and things that we don't typically have the time for. I also like the question that someone had submitted earlier about, this disappointment and processing my emotions and my child's emotions. How do I manage both? And another thing we touch on some of these webinars is how to actually facilitate some conversations within the family, talking about this time and the different emotions, maybe going a little deeper than just the surface of activities and schedules and things changing and being canceled. Maybe this gives us an opportunity to explore as a family all the feelings we have. The same could be said with a friend group as well. And last, this is a really unique opportunity for reflection, especially if we find ourselves home with not a lot of structure a lot of the time. And, in an interesting way, this is a possible time for resetting. When things do reopen and we emerge from, this time, we can have an opportunity to pick and choose the things that we really were enjoying in our life before COVID. we want to get back to those, but maybe there are things that you find you really were not enjoying. They weren't fulfilling for you. And this gives us the opportunity to decide what we focus on, what we schedule for ourselves, what things we really follow and include in our lives as things are reopening. And so the idea of making meaning really speaks to how do we really harness those unique benefits of this time and make it meaningful. And this could be particularly helpful in coping with a loss of a loved one. Certainly, this doesn't alleviate the pain that we're experiencing. And this is an ongoing process of accepting and making meaning of what is. Perhaps remembering your loved one in a really special way. Perhaps, the passing of a loved one or the illness of a loved one has brought the family together in a way that hadn't happened before. I think this could be a nice time to develop new rituals, new routines in a family, regular sit-down dinners once a week or maybe more around the dinner table to kind of connect. This could be some benefits, some ways of kind of coping through this time by connecting in a way that maybe we didn't take advantage of before. This could give us the opportunity to reconnect with our beliefs and our philosophies. Really perhaps take a little inventory of what is important to us, what we're valuing, rather than going through the motions of life. And some people find really immense strength in connecting with their spiritual beliefs or life philosophies. And so certainly if this is something that benefits you, we encourage you to tap into that. And if not, perhaps explore that a bit. And finding the silver lining in a painful situation and focusing on these positive aspects, like we're mentioning, can kind of change up that emotional experience for us. And again, it's not getting rid of those negative emotions, just allowing them to be there with perhaps some other emotions too, feeling more hopeful, more energized, more motivated, perhaps even excited, hopeful about the future. Because this gives us a really unique time to reorganize us, our lives, our future, recognizing that there is a lot of uncertainty, but also an opportunity for growth.
So really thinking about making meaning is really finding that narrative that you want this period of your life to have, or any experience in your life to have. Whether it's a painful experience or a positive experience, at the end of the day, really what matters is what is the story that you created out of that, and finding meaning in that experience. Every single part of your life is going to continue to build up that narrative, but you do have a choice in how you frame that and what lens you put into it.
And some specific ideas along this idea of making meaning that we kind of collated. This certainly isn't exhaustive, but these are some strategies on how to really capitalize on this. So finding ways to help others. If you Google virtual volunteering, there are actually a lot of opportunities here to connect and volunteer remotely. For example, I think there's a club where writing letters to elderly adults who are in a home separated from family is one option. So I encourage you to just do a little exploring online and see what options are there. Similarly, caring for others in our community, neighbors, perhaps that are not able to leave the home, for who are more at risk. Perhaps there's a way to contribute and help with them. Reconnecting. This is a really interesting time where we're connecting virtually, but finding ways to reconnect in a virtual way with people that really are meaningful to us. And I recognize some people are trying out socially distanced gatherings too, using all precautions, but that could be an option for you if you choose to as well. Self-care, we talk about it a lot for ourselves and how to kind of manage how we are treating ourselves, and being kind to ourselves can be especially important during a really stressful time. And these could be small, right? Taking a little extra long shower, or, cooking something you really enjoy, having a nice little snack for yourself, going out for walks and noticing the birds and the things around you. could be really helpful in just taking care of ourselves during this time. And lastly, like I spoke before, reevaluating what's important. We have this chance to look at what means something to us, keep the things that we like in our lives, and perhaps let go of some of those things that weren't fulfilling, weren't bringing us joy, because it really is up to us what we decide to include and give attention to in our lives going forward. Okay. So we have the opportunity now to answer some questions live. So again, I'll refer you to the Q&A box, type it in, and we will try and get to it as best we can. We do have some questions that everyone submitted when they registered. We selected a few that were really connected with the topic, so we can review some of those. We recognize that we are at time right now at 8:45, but we do have another few moments to get through some of these questions and answer the things that you're curious about. Okay. So one of the questions was, how am I supposed to further my career when my industry is closed due to the pandemic? This is a very appropriate and understandably frustrating and scary thing. And so while we don't have a perfect answer for what to do, we can point you to some helpful strategies on how to navigate this time. Certainly accepting the situation would be a big part of the puzzle here, however challenging that is. So a balance of acceptance with also recognizing what you can control, like we talked about. So are there ways of exploring creatively how to, if your job will resume, how to kind of grow and expand? Perhaps your organization will be interested in new opportunities and new ideas. And so this could be a nice time of reflecting, what can I bring to the table? What might be next steps for this organization or my company? Use this time to also connect with the people and the colleagues, if you have, for that social support, because my sense is you're probably not alone in this situation too. And so when we tap into that social support, it can help us feel validated, like we're not the only one in this situation, because you're certainly not. And it might be worthwhile too to be thinking about like a backup plan as well. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, so we may not know when these positions will be opening again. And if they do, what that will even look like, if there'll be as many positions available. So naturally, that brings up a lot of anxiety. And at the same time, it might be worthwhile to think ahead of what opportunities would you like to pursue if there was to be a change in career? What would you be interested in? Perhaps focusing some of your time and attention on building up the skills that would be helpful for your position, or perhaps another one to really, buffer, bolster your resume if you do decide to look elsewhere or have that as an outcome. And the second question, how to encourage your child to move away from screen time, Netflix, Minecraft, out of bed. Super challenging. I hear this question a lot from parents, and our strategies would vary a little bit depending on the age. But I think we do talk about this in some of the other series and webinars. And one strategy is a little bit of antecedent control, which means setting up some kind of schedule. Collaboratively with your teen. For a younger child, you may take more of that initiative, but for a teen and a young adult, coming up with, well, how would you like to structure your day? One of our webinars talks about the 5 types of activities that we ideally would incorporate through our day: service, physical exercise, social, something fun, and something service, helping others, and mastery. So that could, if you refer back to that webinar, that could provide a little bit of structure to building a schedule for your young adult, collaboratively with your young adult. So having some other options could be really meaningful.
It's also important to remember that particularly for teens and young adults, the dynamic in the relationship is different. And Netflix and Minecraft are really privileges, right? So as a parent, having a very open and honest conversation about how their expectations and consequences, really this is in alignment with preparing them, for the bigger challenges that they will be facing as they transition through high school to college or to a job, right? So having those conversations in a collaborative way where there's discussion about a schedule, but there's also this very clear message, this is a privilege. And while, you are a teen or a young adult and we respect your independence and your choices, this is still a home and there are rules, and we all agree to follow them. In the future, when there's challenges in school or in college, there will be that collaboration, but there will also be consequences. And that's part of the skills that we want, teens and young adults to be able to develop to then successfully navigate that outside world. So the third question that we have here is actually asking us about the transition from high school to college in the midst of what's happening, and when there is already anxiety. So there is not, one perfect question about this, one perfect answer to this question. For some teens and adults and children who experience anxiety, the pandemic and the quarantine can actually be quite relieving. Not having to get out of their house, there's not a lot of consequences, the schools are flexible, schedule at homes are more flexible. So being mindful if your child or young adult is in that group, that the transition may be more challenging once they have to start going out in the world. So as we were discussing earlier, making it still in a safe way, part of your daily routines, being able to have spaces where they leave the house, where they're still facing those things that make them anxious, right? So that in the time that we're in the pandemic, the anxiety is not getting stronger and making it harder for them. One of the most difficult things is gonna be helping them deal with uncertainty, because also you are dealing with your own uncertainty. And in that sense, modeling for your child how to cope with these things is important. Letting them know that, you're also worried because we're not entirely sure about what's gonna happen. That doesn't mean that there are not things that we can do, right? To keep one, ourselves safe in the middle of the pandemic, and two, to work towards the goals that they had in terms of transition to college. Really open communication where you're first taking care of your own anxiety, right? And managing your emotions, to then being able to model how you do that, and have a conversation about your young adult worries, and address them together. Keeping as much as you can, your young adult informed about what things may look like in terms of the college transition so that they can prepare will be helpful. And being mindful that you will not have all the information. Our next question is about the best way for your teen to engage with friends in the summer, and can they see each other? So while we're healthcare providers, we're definitely gonna relay that to the public health resources. Right now, New York is transitioning into a phase 1. While there is hope that a lot of things will reopen and we may be able to get together in smaller groups, the truth is that we don't have certainty. So make sure that you have a reliable source of information like the CDC, or the announcements by the New York State governor, and just kind of follow the rules the best way you can. I think more than that, managing your team's expectations about what may or may not happen is important. Working with them on radically accepting that there is a possibility they may not be able to hang out in large groups or hang out a lot, or there may be spikes in New York again. So it's really conveying continuously clear communication, but also helping them manage their own expectations. And the last question that we have is, where do we go from here? Well, we definitely are going into a new normal. That's what we know. We're not going backwards, right? We're going into a new reality. And it's certainly going to have its challenges and painful moments. But we can definitely equip ourselves and our families with skills and tools to navigate whatever that new normal is going to be. So we are definitely past time. We are very grateful and very happy that you were joining us tonight to have this important topic. One thing that you definitely want to remember is that none of this is easy. It takes a lot of work to be able to get comfortable with some of the skills. And tonight is the first step. As we mentioned, there's been other very helpful webinars, all of which are available for free and have been pre-recorded. There's other resources online and elsewhere, so there's definitely tools to support you and your family during this time.
Thank you for joining us.
You'll have a good night.